Welcome to the Long Jawn podcast with your host, Joseph Camperman. I am back with episode 12, You're Fired. This episode will air live. It will air tomorrow, Tuesday, May 30th on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Typically, I do film these episodes the last couple of weeks live. This is a pre-recorded stream because I am pre-recording it Monday morning, May 29th. Happy Memorial Day, everyone. Today, we take a time to remember those who have fought for our freedoms in this country, and I am incredibly proud to be an American citizen and live in this country with the privileges that come with it. So without further ado, I do want to get into this episode titled You're Fired. Again, you can find me on the Long Jawn podcast on YouTube, YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at the Long Jawn podcast, and Twitter at the Long Jawn pod. So check out my social medias, and you'll also be able to watch this stream for as long as you want. So kicking off this episode, I figured I'd give a little bit of an explanation on why I took the week off. Again, I took the week off because I was really busy, and so this topic number one is I'm back, and give a little bit of explanation on why I took the week off. So I work for the town of Wilkesboro in Wilkesboro, North Carolina, and I am one of my many jobs as events coordinator. And if anybody follows any form of NASCAR, which I don't, but by de facto I do now because the North Wilkesboro Speedway in our sister town opened up, and they had not had a race there for over 25 years. So NASCAR, once they opened it up, it was a big campaign to reopen the North Wilkesboro Speedway, which many people thought would eventually just be demolished and done away with. It sat vacant for over 2 decades, and they had this huge campaign to bring the North Wilkesboro Speedway back. And NASCAR rewarded that with hosting their NASCAR All-Star Race event there on Sunday, May 21st. In conjunction with the NASCAR All-Star Race Hauler Parade on Thursday, May 18th, both towns, Wilkesboro and North Wilkesboro, were required to have a Fan Fest event. So I have been really, really busy planning that, of course, the months leading up to that Thursday, May 18th date. But on Thursday, May 18th, I was very, very busy in getting that together. And then, of course, all the stuff that comes with breaking down an event and, pulling down everything that needs to be broken down that typically doesn't go up in your town. And it was a very, very busy couple of weeks. And so I decided, I'm going to, instead of rushing this podcast and coming up with an episode that, maybe feels rushed or not prepared, I'm going to take the week off and focus a little bit more on my full-time job, which is not this job. And so moving on to topic number 2, which is really the crux of this entire show, titled You're Fired. I'm talking about the Philadelphia 76ers head coaching vacancy. So this episode is going to focus a lot on the NBA because, of course, that's right now what the NBA, the sports news is all about. If you're following, any major sports, the NBA is at the forefront right now because we are fixing to head to the NBA Finals here in the next week. So with that being said, I don't follow a ton of MLB or Major League Hockey or any of those sports. And so I typically, I don't know enough about them. I have my favorite teams, but I don't know enough about them to put out good quality content. So typically I'm sticking with, soccer or football, if you want to call it, American football and the NBA. So moving on to topic number 2, that is the Philadelphia 76ers head coaching vacancy. On May 16th, the Philadelphia 76ers announced that they were parting ways with head coach, now ex-head coach, Doc Rivers. Of course, this didn't come as a shock to many people because I believe he could have actually been fired last year had James Harden not only played about 2.5 months with the team, or maybe a little bit more if you want to count the playoffs. And so with that being said, they weren't going to fire him last year, but the expectation really was, in my opinion, was Eastern Conference Finals or bust. And that sort of is a low expectation. If you look at an NBA team, it should be finals or bust. But the Philadelphia 76ers have not progressed past the Eastern Conference semifinals since 2001. And in the 3 years that Doc Rivers was the coach of the Philadelphia 76ers, he amassed a record of 154-82 in the regular season and 20-15 in the record in the playoffs. However, those 3 years he was with the 76ers were marred by the fact that he did not progress past what many Sixers fans would like to see, the Eastern Conference semifinals. So, it's a difficult situation here because you're looking at multiple different avenues that the 76ers could have gone but didn't go. So, of course, when the season started, this is a Harden and Embiid-backed team with supplementing people like De'Anthony Melton, Tyrese Maxey, Tobias Harris, but those two guys were at the crux of the team. As the season progressed, Maxey started, building off of a very good season the year prior and gotten even better. And it was really this triple head guy. In the playoffs, I thought Tobias Harris had his best playoff performances with the 76ers this year. Even though he was hit and miss at times, he sort of didn't produce at all in the last couple of years in the playoffs. So that was a breath of fresh air in a way for some in some games. But ultimately, Doc Rivers didn't meet the Philadelphia 76ers expectations. And so they decided to part ways with him. And, when I first found out about this, it was in the heat. It was at the height of planning for these FanFest event and get ready for the day of event. And I didn't have a whole lot of time to dwell on it, to be honest with you guys. But after it took place, I started thinking, after I took some time I took some time off from this page and really did some thinking on what this means for the Sixers. And there are so many questions. Ultimately, the new head coach of the 76ers, which we don't know yet, as I'm filming this on Monday morning, has three really, really big questions. Can you keep Joel healthy in the playoffs? Because, of course, we were lucky to sweep the Brooklyn Nets in the playoffs, but he didn't play the last two games. And so he didn't play the last game. And then, of course, he missed the first game of the Sixers Celtics. And, of course, they won both of those games. But, can you keep Joel healthy in the playoffs? Or really, to be honest, anytime in the season, which he's done better this year, staying healthy in the season. Do you ship Tyrese Maxey, who is a budding star, with picks like maybe your 2020, 2030 first-round pick, which is incredible how many years we don't have first-round picks for? Do you ship him for the 2020 first-round picks for a star, and you combine that with Tyrese Maxey? And also, where does Harden fall into this equation? Because James Harden is a free agent, essentially, with a player option that he could stay with the 76ers this year, but it's looking semi-unlikely. We just don't know enough yet. I think the coach will play into Harden's decision on whether to stay or not. Harden is sort of caddied the 76ers into a corner where if they don't keep him, they're going to be stuck in a little bit of a cap nightmare, and it's going to make things difficult. Of course, Daryl Morey, who is the general manager for the 76ers, he has done really well with working contracts and stuff. But, ultimately, at the end of the day, money is money, and there's only so much of it in the NBA. So, you can move it around, but it eventually will come back to bite you. And I have a feeling that's happening right now with the 76ers. So the difficult part is now the 76ers have to decide really two things. Do you hire a coach with limited experience, or do you hire a coach with a lot of experience if you think you're in win now mode? So every fan would think that even if Harden departs, the 76ers are in win now mode, because ultimately they still have Tyrese Maxey, they still have Joel Embiid, they have a few other guys like PJ Tucker, and a few other players that are staying with them. You can throw Tyrese, whether you like it or not, you can throw Tobias Harris into that mix. They still have him. And so the question is, what route do you go? What route do you go as far as your coach hiring? Do you decide to, pick a guy who you think you can win games with immediately, or do you sort of go back to the drawing board and, use those two guys as centerpieces for building a team over the next couple of years, and maybe you don't make it to the playoffs next year, but or maybe you make it as an 8th seed. So there are a couple of coaching candidates that the 76ers have been linked to, but of course, nothing really has fully been confirmed. The first one is Frank Vogel. Of course, he is right now considered potentially a dark horse to win the Phoenix Suns head coaching vacancy, which I'll get to later on in this episode. He obviously won a title with the Los Angeles Lakers recently, but was let go. I don't know much about Vogel to give you a this is my guy type of guy. But I would say Frank Vogel would be somebody that wouldn't inherently be a bad thing for 76ers. I just don't know if it's the best option. The second candidate is Mike D'Antoni. Now, this one is an interesting one because there wasn't a whole lot of traction on this candidate. There isn't a whole lot of traction on whether or not the 76ers are even interested in him. But they were apparently close to bringing him in prior to hiring Doc Rivers 3 years ago. And of course, now that they have James Harden technically still on their team, he coached Harden through many successful seasons. So would that be a play of like, hey, Harden, we're hiring your guy. Do you want to stay? And is that something that Harden would do? Because you don't want to hire someone to be like, oh, Harden, we're bringing this guy back. And Harden goes, oh, by the way, I don't care. I'm still leaving. Like, there would have to be other reasons to hire Mike D'Antoni. And I think there would be, but that I think would be a huge reason, would be in efforts to try to keep James Harden to stay. And does that make you seem really desperate? I'll leave that up to you guys to decide. The third candidate is former Phoenix Suns coach Monty Williams. So unfortunately, I was looking today, and it looks like there are rumors that Monty Williams could potentially be taking a year off. This is my personal preference on who I would most likely desire the 76ers to hire, because I don't feel like Monty Williams was the direct reason behind why the Phoenix Suns did not progress further in the playoffs. They have a very star-studded team. I'm not going to get to that right now in this topic, but I don't feel like Monty Williams was given enough time with the team they have right now to make a determination that he didn't deserve to be the coach of the Phoenix Suns. So he'd be my preferred choice, but it looks like he may not even coach this year. Moving on to the fourth of 5 candidates that I'm highlighting, you've got Sam Cassell. So this is an interesting one because he's a current assistant for the 76ers. I believe that if the 76ers don't hire him, because he should be considered a favorite, but believe that the 76ers don't hire him, he's gone. Like, he's not staying with the Sixers. This would be the obvious choice if the Philadelphia 76ers didn't feel like they were in a win now mentality, and that's because he doesn't have any head coaching experience. So, we've seen this with the Boston Celtics. They hired a coach that doesn't have a head coaching experience, and I mean, it's working out well, but there are always those moments where you're like, okay, experience would help here, and they're not going to get that opportunity if they hire a guy like Cassell. But I believe that he would be a very, very good fit for the team, being that he has a great relationship with Tyrese Maxey and James Harden, and that always helps when you have a coach you're bringing in that has a good relationship with your players. They're more receptive to what he's bringing to the table on whether they're changing things or all that good stuff. And so I would say Monty Williams, number 1, Sam Cassell, number 2, because I don't know if I would rule out a coach just because he doesn't have head coaching experience. I think maybe that could be the 76ers kryptonite. Like, stop trying to pick the guy that you think, oh, this is the guy that's going to win us a finals. Well, how has that worked out for you? It's not worked out well. So I would like to see Cassell given an opportunity, if not with the 76ers, somewhere else. But moving on to the 5th candidate, and of course, this is probably the most obvious choice for pundits. I don't know if it is for fans, but the most obvious choice right here is former Milwaukee Bucks head coach Mike Budenholzer, who was released sort of shockingly by the Bucks this past month because he didn't progress to the Eastern Conference semifinals. They lost in the first round, but they also didn't have their star Giannis Antetokounmpo for many games. So here's what you get with Mike Budenholzer if you hire him. You get plenty of experience. He's an ex-coach of the year. He won a title with the Milwaukee Bucks, first one in, I believe, 50 years in 2021. Those are those 3 main things, right? You get a guy with experience. You get a guy with, head coach of the year experience with winning a title. The criticism is that he sort of had some issues similar to Doc Rivers, where he didn't make in-game adjustments. And I will say, if anything frustrated me more as a fan of the 76ers, it was that Doc Rivers could have made adjustments, but didn't. And I just don't know if this would be a good fit for the 76ers, because is he a better coach than Doc Rivers? I'm not going to comment on that. Doc Rivers is has a very illustrious career, something Mike Budenholzer doesn't have as much of. I don't know where I fall on this in opinion-wise. He's not my guy that I would choose first off. The question that we have to ask as a fan is, was his success correlated with how dominant Giannis was? It remains to be seen, because the Bucks have just hired their new head coach, the Raptors assistant. And the next question is, can he improve the 76ers budding star Tyrese Maxey? Because Maxey is on a trajectory that could end up resulting in him being a top NBA player, but he still needs, to continue to grow. And so can Budenholzer improve and help grow Tyrese Maxey? So there's a lot of questions regarding the 76ers job. And ultimately, it really comes down to, are they going to take a flyer, or are they going to go with the safest bet? Because of all these coaches, probably the safest bet is Mike Budenholzer. The most risky bet would be Sam Cassell, or Cassell. But, do they fall in between? Do they got a guy like Nick Nurse potentially, who doesn't have a great relationship with the team, but has good experience and may bring some things to the table that the 76ers are lacking? There's a lot of question marks here. And right now, I think the 76ers and it appears that they're taking their fine time, which I'm not opposed to, with saying, look, who do we want as the next coach of this team? And how is it going to affect the way that this team works moving forward? So that is a perfect segue into my next topic. Topic number 3, NBA Coaching Carousel. So, of course, there's quite a few teams that are in need of a coach. Some of them have filled their coaching needs already with the Milwaukee Bucks and the name is slipping me, but there's another team that the Houston Rockets. There you go. Those two teams have already filled their head coaching vacancies. So the following head coaching vacancies: Phoenix Suns, Philadelphia 76ers, Detroit Pistons, and Toronto Raptors. So starting with the Phoenix Suns, this is probably, I would say, of all these teams, teams outside of the Bucks, and I would actually say over the Bucks, but Bucks ranking 2, but they've just filled their head coaching vacancy. The Phoenix Suns has got to be one of the most attractive jobs, and this is partially because they're 2 years removed from a finals, a Western Conference Finals. Well, no, they made it to the finals. They won the Western Conference Finals. They're 2 years removed from a finals loss, but they're still 2 years removed from that. You walk into a star-studded team with Booker, Durant, Ayton, and Chris Paul. Devin Booker. I mean, the Devin Booker, Kevin Durant duo is amazing. Then you throw in DeAndre Ayton and then Chris Paul, and that's a star-studded team. Like I said, to me, it's the most attractive job of any of these teams. There looks like they've got 4 current candidates, with potentially Frank Vogel rumored as a favorite. It looks like Mike Budenholzer is obviously being considered, Nick Nurse, Ty Lue, who is the current Clippers coach but could be lured away from the Clippers to coach the Phoenix Suns. So this is a really interesting one. I'm curious to see how this plays out, because I'm looking at the West as a whole. And yes, while you've got the Nuggets in the finals, the Phoenix Suns could very well compete next year. Like they've got the stars. They've got, the conference. I don't think the Western Conference is going to be as competitive. Maybe I could be wrong. A lot of things can change in 8 months, 4 months, whatever. But yeah, that's my opinion with the Phoenix Suns, is they're very attractive. Of course, I spent plenty of time on the Philadelphia 76ers, but right now they believe to be in win now mode. They have to deal with who Harden is, whether hard to keep Harden, and is Joel a piece to keep around. Now, I've got to quickly focus on this, because this is something I didn't focus on in topic 2. There are rumors that you could potentially ship Joel Embiid for multiple first-round picks and a star and rebuild. Those rumors are absolute hogwash. If 76ers did that, I think they're not ready to admit that the process has not gone as well as they had hoped. But trading your best player on the team, I think, is foolish. Now, yeah, did he disappoint in the playoffs? Absolutely. But trading your best player on the team is admitting, is giving up on him. I don't know if it would set a good precedent in the locker room. I think it's ridiculous. So yes, he's a player you've got to keep around. But if you're a coach taking that job, whether to keep James Harden or whether you can lure James Harden and make it enticing for him to stay, that's got to be potentially a red flag if a coach just doesn't want to deal with it. Whereas a job like the Phoenix Suns, you've got your roster already set up. You just have the pressure of, if you don't win, you're probably getting fired. But of course, that's that's a pressure for every coach. But I think the stakes are very high with the Suns. Their margin for error is very limited because they have all these players. They're not going to have them forever. And I think that really the expectation is you better make it to the Western Conference Finals next year. Moving on to the third coaching vacancy, the Detroit Pistons. So Dwayne Casey resigned as the head coach and is transitioned into a management role. The new coach would obviously be tasked with developing a young core of players, which highlight Cade Cunningham and Jaden Ivey. That duo potentially has a chance to be a very great backcourt duo for many years with the right coaching. Some information I pulled from the Detroit Free Press stated that their finalists for the jobs were New Orleans Pelicans assistant Jawn Collins, Milwaukee Bucks assistant Charles Lee, and former Connecticut head coach Kevin Ollie. I don't know if Mike Budenholzer or Nick Nurse would ever be considered for this job, because I'm thinking those both are coaches that someone with a lot of coaching experience would probably want them to stay. And not like, well, the coaching expectation for those two coaches would be, hey, you have experience winning a finals. What can you do for our team? Whereas the Detroit Pistons seem to have a more longer, they have a little bit longer to go before they're, even Eastern Conference Finals ready. And I think that both Budenholzer and Nick Nurse are going to end up taking jobs that are with win now teams. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. And maybe they don't pick, they go with maybe either of those two coaches take the year off. But with that being said, I really feel like the Detroit Pistons could be getting a player, a coach that is maybe not as much experience or has a lot of experience, but that the coach himself has an understanding that it's not a requirement to make it to the Eastern Conference Finals next year. It's a requirement to help develop these players to eventually get there. And maybe Budenholzer and Nick Nurse would fit that bill, but I think they're going to be gone before the Detroit Pistons would have any interest in bringing them in. Then moving on to the final head coaching vacancy, which is the Toronto Raptors. Some names that have been thrown out there is former Nets coach Steve Nash, JJ Redick, who's a TV analyst, but obviously an ex-NBA player, Kings associate head coach Jordi Fernandez, Spanish national team coach Sergio Scariolo, Nuggets assistant David Adelman, and the Denver Nuggets assistant David Adelman, and the Miami Heat's assistant Chris Quinn. I really think Steve Nash could be a favorite here for this job. I don't really believe it was his fault that the whole Harden, Kyrie Irving, and Kevin Durant thing was just a complete crap show. I think that you've got to consider Steve Nash is still a decent head coach, and I would not be surprised if he is a finalist for the job. They have some really big decisions on whether to bring Fred VanVleet back. There are decisions on, the Raptors are a really odd team because they're, you've got Siakam, you've got a few players that are building blocks, but there is a limbo. So this would also be one of those developing type of the Detroit Pistons and the Toronto Raptors head coaching vacancies probably have a little less pressure than the Phoenix Suns and the 76ers do. So moving on to topic number 4, which is probably the topic I'm the most excited to talk about, and this is the NBA Finals update. So when I was planning earlier on, well, of course, last week, but earlier on leading up to this show, I thought, man, I'm going to be able to give a preview of the NBA Finals because the Miami Heat are going to more than likely win this series. I've never been more wrong. So the Denver Nuggets swept the Los Angeles Lakers. Personally, I was in the Western Conference Finals. And personally, I was really shocked by this because I expected the Lakers to at least win one game. And honestly, when I had the Camper report, my brother Benjamin Camperman on the show, I actually had the Lakers winning this. This series. I just felt like the Lakers had played really well leading up to this, and they just got absolutely dusted off the court. Like I said, I was shocked that they didn't at least win one game. Jokic has been dominant, to say the least. And I'm going to quickly take a little excerpt of this topic and talk about what the expectation of an MVP is. So I'm a 76ers fan. Joel Embiid, the center for the 76ers, won the MVP this year. And I think it was deservingly so. But his performances in the playoffs, specifically Game 7 at the Celtics Stadium, was terrible, to put it lightly. 15 points is not something that you want off of your MVP candidate. And Jokic, if anything, has taken his success in the regular season, and has converted it directly to the playoffs. And that is what MVPs do. Now, I'm not discrediting Joel Embiid's season because he had a very, very good season, and I do believe he deserved to win MVP. However, he didn't back up his regular season performance in the playoffs, in my opinion. And because of that, it's hard for me to not look at that and say, you know what, Nikola Jokic has been a better overall player in the last year. But, you don't use the playoff stats to gauge MVP. And so, yes, Embiid had a better regular season, and I think it deserved to win that MVP. But Jokic has really been following up with his MVP runner-up season and has been incredibly dominant in the playoffs. So the Denver Nuggets are locked in. And this is the craziest part. The Denver Nuggets, because they swept the the Los Angeles Lakers, they're resting. I mean, their players are going to be rested. Now, there are two ways of looking at this. A rested team is a good team because you can get healthier, but is too much rest a detriment? And I think it can be, but in this instance, I don't think it will be. Ultimately, tonight, we're going to find out. Tonight, I'm filming this on Monday morning. I wish I could have filmed it after the game, but it's Memorial Day, and I have plans for later on today. So the Heat were up 3-0 in this series and hosted Game 4, and with a chance to sweep the Celtics. I expected them to sweep them. However, I made this very clear. I said, Game 4 is not that. Game 4 when the Celtics won Game 4. I said this before. I said, look, Game 5 is not important. I know that sounds crazy, and it's a bold take, but Game 5 wasn't important to me. I said when I was thinking about this earlier on this week, I said, if the Celtics win Game 5, the ball is in Miami's court, no pun intended. Miami had an opportunity to put away the Celtics at home on Friday night and didn't do that. And because of that, they have now a chance. The series is 3-3 after a crazy 104-103 win in the Celtics win in the Miami Heat Stadium. And now Boston gets to host Game 7, which is what I expected this game. I expected the series early on to go to Game 7. After the Heat went up 3-0, I thought there's no way this game goes to even – I thought there's no way this game goes to Game 7. But Boston now gets a chance to host Game 7, and not only host Game 7, but make history by mounting the greatest NBA playoff of all time. And that is something that – all motivation is in Celtics' home court now. If the Heat lose, it'll be the greatest flop of all time in the playoffs, in my opinion. But it would also be the greatest flop for a coach that I really thought deserved to be considered head coach of the year, Eric Spoelstra. Because to me, what he did with an 8th seed team should be looked at and in awe. However, if he fails to bring them to the finals after being up 3-0 in the series, it'll be hard to not look at him differently because – yeah, you brought your team to this, but it'd be one thing if he brought his team to the Eastern Conference Finals and they just didn't do well. They won maybe one game and it's a 5-game series, but they were up 3 games in this series. And if they do not win tonight, it'll be a big embarrassment for that organization. Here's a few statistics for teams that have overcome a 3-1 series deficit and won Game 7 in the NBA playoffs. Of course, it was the 2015-16 Cleveland Cavaliers were the only team to ever have done it in down 3-1 in the NBA Finals and win Game 7. There are 13 teams that have overcome the 3-1 series deficit. The Nuggets are the only NBA team to come back from 3-1 series deficits multiple times in the same year, and that was in their 19 and 20 season. So it's a really interesting situation you've got here because if the Celtics win tonight, there's a lot of motivation that they can beat a good team and make it to the playoffs and the finals. However, being down 3-0 is not, you're not going to, they're not going to be able to pull off. I think even being down 3-1, the Nuggets will finish them off. And so if it's the Nuggets Celtics, I have to give it to the Nuggets because I really think that I don't know if there's a player that can stop Nikola Jokic. Now, Horford did a pretty good job stopping Joel Embiid. Maybe he can do the same thing for Jokic, but I like my chances if I'm the Nuggets. I also like my chances if I'm the Nuggets because you're getting a team that's not going to be as rested as you are. And and now this game is going to Game 7. If the Heat win, can they continue the magic and win in the finals? It remains to be seen. Ultimately, this series has been incredible from a competitive standpoint because no team in 76 years has come back from 3-0. If they do this, that's got to be looked at as just outright incredible. So enough of the NBA. I'm going to segue into my NFL portion of this episode with topic number 5, DeAndre Hopkins release. So this came as not a shock to me at all. I believe the Arizona Cardinals were trying to ship Hopkins for many months now. As soon as Gannon got hired, I think that Hopkins was not too keen on being part of what I really ultimately believe is a rebuild. Even though they do have Kyler Murray, I think Kyler Murray is going to get given 1, if not 2 years more. And then it's like, we're going to cut our losses if he doesn't progress in his performances. And so Hopkins gets released on Friday by the Arizona Cardinals, and they save $8.1 million in cap space while taking on his entire salary, $22.6 million in dead cap this year. So he got what he wanted, but the thing is he held the cards all along. DeAndre Hopkins had a no release clause in his trade. No trade clause in his contract. And so with that being said, because he had a no release clause in his contract, no trade clause in his contract, he got to decide which team he went to. And no team, I believe, wanted to take on any of that contract. And so because of that, the Cardinals were forced to release him and save money in cap space. I don't know if this was a good idea. I think ultimately Hopkins probably forced his way out of there, and somewhat understandably so. I think his relationship with Kyler Murray is not very strong. And so, he was like, I'll love Arizona, but he's ultimately probably going to now go and try to win a ring. So Hopkins has listed 5 teams that he would like to play for. Those are his wish list: the Buffalo Bills, the Philadelphia Eagles, the Kansas City Chiefs, the Baltimore Ravens, and the Los Angeles Chargers. So I'm going to go down this list and discuss sort of some options and what, the pros and cons of his arrival to each of these teams would be. So you've got the Buffalo Bills as the first team. Josh Allen would get a great number 2 receiver opposite Stephon Diggs. And all of a sudden, Stephon Diggs, Gabe Davis, Dalton Kincaid, who's the new tight end that they drafted, who is basically a receiver, and DeAndre Hopkins, that would make a very scary offense. I still don't think it deals with the fact that the Bills don't have a solid running game. I think that if anything, so that's my pros are. My pros are potentially one of the best offenses in the NFL. My cons are, would the introduction of DeAndre Hopkins make them less of a running team? Because at some point you're going to have to run the ball, and they weren't able to do it very well. And so that could be a con. Moving on to the Philadelphia Eagles, this would be the best wide receiver trio. I wouldn't even blink an eye. You got Hopkins, A.J. Brown, and Devontae Smith as your trio. It would make ultimately one of the best trios in the NFL, and potentially, depending on what they win, one of the best trios of all time. I know it sounds crazy saying this, but you've got 3 1,000-yard season receivers on one team, and with a quarterback that was an MVP runner-up, that it could be very scary. The con of that is, would it leave enough targets for a tight end who is ultimately a top 4 tight end, maybe even a top 3 tight end in the NFL in Dallas Goedert? And would there even be enough targets for DeAndre Swift? So they brought in running back DeAndre Swift. He's a good receiving option. And if you bring in Hopkins, is there enough targets to go around? Because we know that the Eagles' MO is still running the ball. And so I don't know if there'd be enough targets to go around. Does it mean, I would be ecstatic as a fan if he came to the Eagles, but it would be interesting to see how Sirianni worked him in the season, throughout the season into the team's roster. The Kansas City Chiefs are the third candidate. So the cool part about this one is, first of all, I hope he doesn't go there because they don't have a true number 1 receiver. Of course, they have Travis Kelce, the tight end, who is essentially acts as a receiver, and he is Patrick Mahomes' security blanket. But they lost Mecole Hardman and Juju Smith-Schuster this year. So they do have definitely need at receiver. And this would make the Chiefs really tough on offense. So the whole NFL better be hoping that DeAndre Hopkins doesn't sign with the Chiefs. Now, the Baltimore Ravens, this is the funniest one of all of the teams. Because if you had told me, Joseph, the beginning of March, Lamar Jackson has so many receiving options, I would have been like, you got to be kidding me, right? He's got Rashad Bateman, who can't stay healthy, and Mark Andrews. That's about it. Yep, that's about it. But no, fast forward 2 months, and all of a sudden, if you introduce DeAndre Hopkins to the Baltimore Ravens as a receiver who would be catching passes from Lamar Jackson, this would be one of the best offenses in the NFL. And it's crazy how much of a 180 this team has done. But they signed Odell Beckham, which I thought was a very good signing. He may not start in the beginning of the season, but he's going to be a good receiver for them. They drafted arguably one of the best, most athletic receivers in the draft in Zay Flowers out of Boston College. So now, if you pair DeAndre Hopkins with this team, you would have Zay Flowers, Odell Beckham, Mark Andrews, DeAndre Hopkins, and Rashad Bateman. Like that would be such a good wide receiver core. And I think Lamar Jackson would be ecstatic. I don't think it's going to happen, but that would be incredible. The final candidate on his wish list is the Los Angeles Chargers. This is another team that starts. I mean, all of these teams are loaded at offensive weapons, besides maybe the Kansas City Chiefs. The Los Angeles Chargers have wide receivers Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, and newly drafted wide receiver out of TCU, Quentin Johnston. Herbert would not have a lack of receiving threats. And ultimately, you've got Keenan Allen's getting older, Quentin Johnston's a rookie, and Mike Williams has had problems staying healthy. So I think that this would definitely provide more strength to that position, but it would be an improving an already very loaded wide receiver room. And so those 5 teams are very, very interesting because I don't know if there's a clear-cut person that would actually give up a lot of money to get him. And some of these teams are in a cap predicament. So prior to the release, Hopkins was the 3rd highest annual average value salary amongst wide receivers in the NFL. And the real question is, who is going to get him and at what price? Because if it was any other receiver, I would say a 1-year, $10 million deal would do it. Is Hopkins going to sign with a team in those 5 categories for a contract like that? I just don't see a team paying him over $12 million a season, especially because they're not going to sign him to a 1-year. I don't think he'd be signed to a multi-year deal, and that would be interesting. However, there are 2 sleepers that I have that could get him, and those could be candidates for multi-year deals. And that is the Carolina Panthers, who just obviously drafted Bryce Young number 1 overall. They don't have a true number 1 receiver. They have the cap space to be able to sign him to a multi-year deal. So And I think it would be a great security blanket for Bryce Young. I've said this for a while now, even before he got released as a potential trade target. The next team is the Green Bay Packers. So, of course, they lost Aaron Rodgers. This is the Jordan Love era for at least a year, if not 2. And with the departure of wide receiver Alan Lazard, Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs are your 2 receivers on the team that stand out. If you added a guy like DeAndre Hopkins, you get veteran presence and you'd get a guy who's consistent. And they may be able to sign him to a multi-year deal if they can work out the cap. So those are 2 teams that I could see DeAndre Hopkins signing with if he's not interested in winning a ring right away. However, the other 5 teams, I just don't see signing him to a multi-year deal. The only team that maybe could, and of course this would be a stretch, would be ultimately the Buffalo Bills. And I just don't know if I see them doing that. So that is the DeAndre Hopkins trade release is really, really, it could be monumental for the NFL because if he goes to one of those 5 teams, I think that automatically makes them favorites to represent their conference in the Super Bowl. And that's really because ultimately those teams are already stacked and loaded in a lot of positions. And it just makes a already strong position stronger. And so, yeah, it's going to be very exciting to see where Hopkins goes. I think he'll take his fine time. I was thinking about this earlier on in the week, and I thought, you know what? DeAndre Hopkins very well could actually just wait until training camp, and maybe there's an injury, and maybe he settles for more money. You hate to think of it like that, but that is a possibility. And so, yeah, the possibilities are sort of endless because the suitors are endless for your DeAndre Hopkins services. Moving on to topic number 6, and that is the NFL Kickoff Debacle. So this pains me to even say this. But earlier on in the week, the NFL decided to change the NFL kickoff rules majorly. And it could change a lot of things. it really is going to. It remains to be seen whether or not it is as monumental as some fans think it is. But the NFL just changed the kickoff rule to where if you fair catch the football on a kickoff from either the 0.01 yard line and the 24 and 11 24 feet 11 24 yards 3 feet and 11 2 feet and 11 inches, like basically from 0.01 of a yard to 24.99 of a yard, you get it pushed to the 25-yard line. And so I know this is sort of confusing for maybe some people, but essentially what it used to be in the past is if you fair caught the catch, you just caught the ball, gave yourself up in the end zone, it goes to the 25-yard line on a kickoff. On punts, if you catch it before the end zone, you get it where you caught it. However, this rule says on a kickoff, if a team catches it outside of their end zone prior to the 25-yard, before the 25-yard line, before the 25-yard line and after the touch end zone, they get it moved to the 25-yard line. So you could fair catch it at the 1-yard line and you get moved 24 yards up. And they all say this is because we are moving towards player safety. I'm going to lay into the NFL on this one because if they really cared about player safety, they would do away with the potentially playing 2 Thursday night games or Thursday night games, period. But no, that makes too much money. So they have to now offset it by coming up with a rule that a lot of players are really unhappy with because it does two things. We're moving towards potentially no kickoffs, which can be a game changer for many teams. And does this push special teams in jeopardy? Because special teams I think a lot of people don't realize that special teams is a way that a player can actually get moved to a starter. Because if they excel in special teams, that's the number one way that a guy who's not drafted in the first 2 rounds, and maybe even, but normally it's for rounds 4 through 7 or 5 through 7, where they can prove themselves, either drafted or undrafted, that they deserve to be a starter on the team. You see that many times over the NFL, that teams that have excelled in players that have excelled in special teams have moved on to being successful as a starter for the team. So, this is a big ordeal. And I think that the NFL could end up regretting it, but ultimately I think we're moving potentially towards not having a kickoff at all, which I think is ridiculous. So, that is an interesting fact because in the past, if you would have fair caught it at the 1-yard line, you would get it at the 1-yard line. And that's why no one would ever do that. And so, yeah, it's going to be interesting. It's going to change the dynamics on how teams kick off the ball. Because if ultimately, why would you want to pin someone yards 1 through 25? Now everyone's going to be trying to going for a kickoff into the end zone because there's no point trying to net the team before then. So moving on to the final topic of today, and that is, did you know a sports fact? So I did this a couple of weeks ago, and I want to discuss the sports fact of the week that I have come up with. So did you guys know that Scottie Pippen, basketball star for the Chicago Bulls, lost $120 million in career earnings? And this was primarily due to the terrible business decisions he made and poor financial planning throughout his career. Pippen's estimated net worth today is around $20 million. And to put that in example, his fellow teammate, potentially basketball god, Michael Jordan's net worth is in the billions. Now, of course, it's not fair to compare Pippen to Michael Jordan because they've done two very different things with their money. But that gives you an example how 20 million estimated net worth is not very much, and he lost over $120 million in career earnings. And I believe that's why nowadays there's a general push for a lot of sports players to take financial planning seriously because of situations like this, which is not the first time it's happened. Many sports players finish their career and they are bankrupt a few years later. And that's because they don't save their money. They don't invest their money properly. When they do invest their money, it's not paying off because they're not spreading out their investments. And so, of course, I'm not a financial analyst, but it is being taken a lot more serious nowadays because of situations like this, where you've got players who are very wealthy but lose a lot of their money. Of course, a net worth of $20 million is not a bad thing, but it's pretty bad for a player that made as much as he did. So I figured that would be a great way to end this episode. Thank you guys for listening. It's been a really, really fun time talking about anything from the NBA to the NFL and providing you guys with some facts for today. You guys have a good rest of the week. I hope you enjoyed this episode. You can find this episode again on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. It premieres 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Tuesday, May 30th. And of course, I didn't go live today, but this was my first pre-recorded show in a while. So I hope you guys enjoy it. And again, check me out on all my socials. You can find me at YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify and Apple Podcasts at the Long John Podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at the Long John Pod. So check it out. And without further ado, it is been a privilege as your host, Joseph Camperman of the Long John Podcast, to bring to you today episode 12, You're Fired. Guys, have a great rest of the day and peace out.